Welcome to Module 2, Primary Prevention 101. In the previous module, we discussed the basics of domestic and sexual violence. So now we're going to address the ways in which we can prevent violence. First and foremost, though, you need to believe that preventing violence is possible. Oftentimes, people think that these types of abuses are just inevitable. However, they are choices that people make, and we can do something about that. That's where primary prevention comes in. Primary prevention are interventions that are designed to prevent the first-time perpetration or victimization. Now, much of Prevail's services are considered interventions after someone has experienced abuse. And while these services are extremely important and life-saving, they're just not proven to reduce the rates or prevent victimization. So that's where Prevail's primary prevention department comes in. You can see here a list of our initiatives, including healthy relationships education in the schools, 40 developmental assets, Raise the Bar Indiana, Our Community Reads Together, and of course, 100 Men. In order to grasp what violence prevention means today, it's important to know two things. One being the history of violence prevention work, and two being the root causes of violence. Women's movements have been critical in bringing attention to violence and changing culture and laws. The first wave feminist movement was that of the 19th and early 20th centuries, focusing on women's rights, like the right to vote. Then the 1950s and 60s civil rights movements and anti-war movements really began laying the foundation for a second wave feminist movement. And this second wave was really focused on issues of equality and discrimination, including violence. Now, there were many problematic laws that still existed up until recently that normalized violence in relationships. For example, it was not until 1966 that beating became grounds for divorce in New York. However, the plaintiff had to establish that a significant amount of beatings had taken place. Another is a Harris poll that was conducted in 1968, which found that 1/5 of Americans viewed slapping one's spouse acceptable on appropriate occasions. As for a more recent example, marital rape was not considered illegal in Oklahoma and North Carolina until 1993. These movements began with the will of we want this violence to stop. They were prevention-minded. However, due to the excessive need of victim services in the United States, the movement shifted towards responding to crisis and to victims by opening shelters, rape crisis centers, and advocating for change in divorce law, as well as the creation of more substantial abuse laws. Over the past 50-plus years, the victim services field has done a great job at developing services for victims of crime and abuse, but has forgotten the initial mission of preventing these things from ever happening in the first place. So in the early 2010s, prevention began to gain more attention and funding. Now, the CDC funds prevention programming to local organizations through grants, knowing this is the best way to create change. So as we just mentioned, the CDC has begun significantly funding prevention programming. They have extensive research on the topics of violence in America and the best practices for addressing the root causes of such violence. One of those being risk and protective factors. Risk factors are things that make a person more likely to choose to perpetrate. Now, by addressing and reducing risk factors that may contribute to violence, we can reduce the likelihood of individuals choosing to perpetrate. A few examples of CDC recognized risk factors include anger, lack of nonviolent problem-solving skills, social isolation, and poverty. Protective factors, on the other hand, are things that make a person less likely to choose to perpetrate. So by identifying and addressing protective factors that discourage violence and then promoting that and increasing those, we can increase the likelihood of individuals choosing not to perpetrate. Things like neighborhood support, high friendship quality, and academic achievement are examples of CDC-recognized protective factors. The CDC actually has risk and protective factors for different levels, including individual, relational, community, and societal. So for example, if a person is living in a community where socially there are norms that support sexual violence, male superiority, or has high levels of crime, that can contribute to the risk of that individual perpetrating. On the other hand, if a person is living in a community that is well-connected and supportive and promotes equality, that person is going to be more protected from choosing violence as a path. So it's important that prevention efforts predominantly focus on the risk and protective factors regarding perpetration, not victimization. And the reason for this is that victimization is not the sole problem at hand. The real problem, if you think about it, is perpetration, which is causing the victimization. So our focus then should be on stopping the perpetration from happening. Another interesting note about risk and protective factors is that the factors for domestic and sexual violence are very similar, if not the same, for risk and protective factors of other things like suicide, drug and alcohol abuse, and incarceration. This is what we call intersectionality. Expanding upon risk factors, many risk factors are able to exist because of oppression in our society. In order to best understand violence prevention, we must do three things: root ourselves in anti-oppression, understand the complexity of rape culture and power imbalances, and seek to recognize people as complex humans. Humans are not single-issue people. We are all impacted by the ways our identities, cultures, and experiences interact with other forces in the world. We must seek to see people as their whole selves, including how their experiences, influences, and options are impacted by systems of oppression. Now, oppression may be a word that you have heard before, but many don't understand the complexity of it or how it's associated to violence. By definition, oppression is socially sanctioned or socially tolerated abuses of power over others, and we understand it to be the primary root cause of violence. This tree provides a visual representation of how oppression can lead to such violence. Let's take poverty, for example. People who live in poverty experience less power than those in upper classes of socioeconomic status. And because we live in a society that values money and the social forces that tend to keep people in a cycle of poverty, we tend to see violence manifest. When people are pushed down by oppression and structures in our society, violence can occur as a means of gaining power or control back from someone who doesn't have any. However, this does not mean that we are excusing violence, but rather seeking to understand the reasons behind a person's choice or rationale for committing an act of violence. That way, we're able to change the forces that lead to such violence. As previously stated, in order to prevent violence, we must operate from an anti-oppression lens. Rooting ourselves in anti-oppression work enables us to understand systemic and societal barriers that uphold violence. If we do not operate from this perspective, it would be very difficult to prevent violence, as we are not getting down to the root of the matter. Therefore, anti-oppression refers to the ways an individual, community, institution, or system can actively prevent, challenge, and end oppression against other people. And we do so by taking a stand against and addressing the ways oppressed people are prevented access to crucial resources. Anti-oppression work is really the key to the kind of lasting social change that will ultimately prevent sexual violence from occurring. The goal of prevention is for everyone to have equal access to the necessary resources, opportunities, and decision-making mechanisms that can support safe, healthy, and thriving lives. The key to breaking this cycle of oppression is for those in power to not only act to reduce oppression and risk factors, but also to empower those who experience marginalization. When we all have a seat at the table, we are able to take steps towards equity and ultimately empowerment, providing people with what they need and breaking down the barriers that get in the way in the first place. Please stop and think a moment about your why. Why are you involved in 100 Men? Why do you want to lead a small group? Why do you care about the issues of preventing violence and creating a community that's safer for all people? It's important to understand that in order to be change makers, we must start with ourselves. Tremblay states that social justice requires the power of many people working together. However, each person is their own agent of change. One person's actions can have an immense ripple effect on others around them, for better or worse. In fact, anti-oppression work begins with the ways we uproot our own prejudices and learn to see others and ourselves as whole and dynamic. In order to be most effective in anti-oppression work, it is crucial to understand how you've experienced and been affected by oppression, as well as the ways that you may have power or privilege at someone else's expense. This concept of oppression may be difficult for people to understand if they've never personally felt oppressed or felt as though they were oppressing another person or group of people. However, that does not mean that oppression does not exist. There are plenty of people in this world that we can see that have more power or privilege than us, like Jeff Bezos, Bill Gates, or Queen Elizabeth. Now, those are some extreme examples of people who are either in really high levels of authority or have unfathomable amounts of money. We challenge you to examine this power and status wheel and look at the different levels within them. The further the rings go out from the center, the more oppression and powerlessness a person may experience. And people may fall into different rings. For example, a white male who has a disability. This person holds power in some areas and maybe not in others. Another consideration to make is that people can hold power in different spaces. For example, a black businessman in a community meeting full of white people may feel like he has less power, whereas that same man may feel like he has more or equal amounts of power when he is in a situation with other black businessmen. And again, this is what we mean by intersectionality. We are all complex and dynamic people. Now, this is not meant to make you feel guilty for where you may fall in the rings. Rather, it's a mechanism to take a look at the ways people may experience the world. Think about the ways you are connected with systems of oppression and what your experience with power may look like. Ultimately, if we want to be an agent for change, we must look at the power we hold in our lives and yield that power for good, as well as acknowledge the power in order to take a step back and empower someone else. The last point in understanding violence prevention is understanding how rape culture exists in our society. We understand the word culture from a sociological viewpoint to be things that people commonly engage in together as a society. Things like art, education, even table manners. And we find it really difficult to link this word rape in with that concept. We know that at its core, our society is not something that outwardly promotes rape, as the phrase could imply. That is, we don't commonly engage in sexual violence together as a society. But to understand rape culture better, first we need to understand that it's not necessarily a society or group of people that outwardly promotes rape, even though it could be. Rather, when we talk about rape culture, we're discussing something much more implicit. We're talking about cultural practices that excuse or otherwise tolerate sexual violence. We're talking about the ways that we collectively think about rape. More often than not, it's situations in which sexual assault, rape, or general violence are ignored, trivialized, normalized, or made into jokes, like questioning a victim of assault about what they were doing or wearing, or using the phrase like boys will be boys to excuse wrongdoing. Other things like advertisements that sexualize women's bodies to sell a product, or the fact that 3% of rapists will ever serve a day in jail. These types of practices make sexual violence in our society more acceptable than people would think. It's important to understand how rape culture plays into our lives and actively work against it by speaking up, addressing the root cause, and displaying healthy masculinity that values women and shares power. Remember, anti-oppression work starts with us. We all have biases that we need to work through, and it's often easier for us to notice things out there that are problematic. But we must first start with ourselves, and we must practice awareness and understanding that because oppression exists in our society, options and experiences are not the same for every person. So now that we've discussed the root causes of violence, we can talk about the different types of approaches taken in this work. Now, historically, prevention was looked at as something a woman needs to do to make herself safer from a possible attacker. But this is not true prevention. This is what we would call risk reduction. And risk reduction is more focused on reducing a person's risk of being a victim. This includes things like teaching women self-defense or telling them to watch their drink at a bar. While these techniques can have some value, they don't ultimately get at the root of why someone would choose to perpetrate in the first place. Another downfall of risk reduction is that it really takes the responsibility and places it onto the potential victim. It says, you need to do these things to keep yourself safe from someone else's choices. Another common approach that is misconceived as being prevention is outreach and awareness raising. Doing things like going to an event and telling the community about the local domestic violence shelter, or conducting a campaign throughout the local town to speak about how prevalent violence is. These are things that would be categorized as outreach or awareness. These activities are extremely valuable, especially to help the community know what services are available for survivors. However, again, they're not addressing those underlying causes of violence like primary prevention does. Feel free to pause this video and read through the goals of each of the approaches listed on the table, as well as who the target is. Next, we have the social ecological model. The SEM model is a framework that we can use to understand the multifaceted levels within a society and how individuals and the environment interact together within their social system. If our ultimate goal is to stop violence before it begins, then we need to better understand the factors that influence violence. The SEM model allows us to understand the range of factors that put people either at risk for violence or protect them from experiencing it or perpetrating it. Because the SEM has overlapping rings, it shows us that factors at one level will ultimately influence factors at another level. The CDC suggests that it is important to act across multiple levels of the model at the same time. To put it simply, we cannot jump straight into societal changes if the community or individuals within the community are not bought in first. We're going to briefly go over each level of the SEM model and describe factors at play within each one. First, we have the individual level. This level identifies biological and personal history factors that increase a person's likelihood of becoming a victim or perpetrator. For example, attitude towards violence, personal history with violence, substance abuse, or lack of certain skills are all factors that would be considered at the individual level. Prevention strategies at the individual level are aimed to change individual attitudes or increase skills through education. At the interpersonal level, we consider the close relationships a person has and how that contributes to their experience. Prevention strategies at this level would include things like parenting classes or mentoring programs. These strategies are primarily aimed at reducing conflict, fostering problem-solving skills, and promoting healthy relationships. Next, we have the organizational level. At the organizational level, we consider the organizations and social institutions within a community, like schools, nonprofits, places of worship, and businesses. This level of the SEM model looks at how these institutions influence the individuals within them and either protect from violence or increase risk for it. The next level is very similar to the previous. The community level really just looks at how these organizations within the community cooperate and coexist. Prevention strategies here should aim to impact the social and physical environment for those within it, like reducing social isolation, improving economic and housing opportunities, and increasing accessibility and connectivity of a community. Lastly, we have the policy and societal level. This level looks at the broad societal factors that help to create a climate in which violence is either encouraged or prohibited. This would include things such as cultural and social norms, laws, and other policies within larger institutions. Now, while this model may look linear, like the societal is most important and individual is least important, that's simply not true. We believe in working at all levels of the SEM model, and that is why Prevail's prevention programming has programs at various levels within this. For example, 100 Men would fall into the individual and interpersonal levels, Healthy Relationships Education would fall into individual, and Raise the Bar Indiana is an approach that targets individuals but also organizations within the community. If we can address risk and protective factors within multiple levels of the SEM model and target those specifically with prevention strategies, we will have a better chance at making societal changes in the right direction. So now that you understand the social ecological model, we're going to look at what we call the spectrum of violence prevention. The spectrum is very similar to the SEM model in that it looks at the range of opportunities to engage people in prevention work. The spectrum is designed for broad-scale change. It focuses not only on individuals, but also on the environment, including the systems within it and the cultural norms around it that contribute to violence. Feel free to pause this video and read through the spectrum more thoroughly. For the last portion of this module, we're going to discuss the prevention strategies that the CDC has recognized for best preventing sexual and domestic violence. Here we have 5 primary strategies that the CDC calls STOP SV. The first strategy is to promote social norms that protect against violence. This would include promoting protective factors that we talked about earlier. 100 Men actually falls under this strategy. By mobilizing men and boys to be allies, we promote a new norm that actually protects against violence. Next, we have teaching skills that will prevent violence. Things like social-emotional learning in schools, teaching about healthy relationships, and empowerment trainings all contribute to positive skills that prevent against violence. Another strategy the CDC identifies is providing opportunities to support and empower women and girls. An example of this would be supporting programs like Girl Scouts that teach girls about leadership. Next, we have creating protective environments. This is a broad strategy that can also overlap with the other strategies as well. Creating protective environments means increasing protective factors and decreasing risk factors, which is the goal behind 100 Men projects in the community. This can also be done by doing things like increasing safety in schools, establishing inclusive policies in the workplace, and addressing community-level risks through policy change and program implementation. And then lastly, we have supporting survivors to lessen harm. So similar to the CDC's Stop SV strategies, their prevention strategies for domestic violence really overlap in a lot of areas, like supporting survivors, creating protective environments, and strengthening the economic supports for families. Here we can also see that engaging influential adults and peers is a recommended strategy, and this is exactly what 100 Men aims to do. We aim to engage men in the community and mobilize them to be change makers in their families, workplaces, and communities. After all of that information, here's a really simple way of looking at prevention. In prevention, we want to engage people in order to make cultural and systemic changes. We can jump to structures and make changes at the societal and policy levels. However, a lot of models suggest to first start with the individual and aim to change hearts and minds, meaning changing those social norms that promote violence. Then we can target the behaviors of people. And overall, the main goal is to change the structures that keep people oppressed and more at risk for violence, whether that be policies, cultural or social norms, or risk factors like poverty, racism, and power imbalances. You've now finished Module 2, Primary Prevention 101. The next and final module is Module 3, Why Men and Why 100 Men.